fertility. She's among the leading women scientists on academia.net, the author of many papers published in international scientific journals, and the associate editor of leading academic journals. And of course, the host of today will talk about the book called Paul Morland. Is an author, a broadcaster who writes and speaks about population and the big demographic trends across the world. He is described as one of the world's prestigious demographer. And Paul has written three books we can call the trilogy. We'll talk about this. And he is a fellow, was a fellow researcher at Birkbeck University of London, and senior member of St. Anthony College in Oxford. So I am Alfonso Giordano. I teach at Lewis University. I teach demography and social challenges, population, environment, sustainability, and geopolitics, population, and technology. So population is at the center of my research and study. Now, why is it important to talk about this? Let me just point 3-4 points. The first one, demography and please also geography are everywhere. Why? I use also the word geography. I take this liberty not only because I'm a geographer, but also I think, and it's true, that geography as demography are cross-cutting issues that are everywhere, you know, affecting all kinds of social sciences. And of course, I use also geography because Paul Morland used widely in his text the geographic tools. So territory and demography are always in our debate, public debate, political debate, scientific debate, when we talk about overpopulation or environmental migration or use the energy, or for example, the environmental migrant or the seekers, asylum seekers, it's always about geography and demography. So I use normally one example to let understand the students why these are important, these dynamics are so important. Suppose you are in the sea, and the surface wave you see, you feel and you see, are economics, politics, society. Normally, the very important waves are one on your knee, you don't see them. These are demography and geography. They are moving all the rest. But these are long-term, as the French will call the long durée elements. So you need time because they maybe have a change, but you cannot control this change in the short, medium term. So this means that geography is a prism, demography is a destiny? No, big no, of course no. Can be, of course. They teach this normally in the school, that demography is the destiny and geography is a prism. Now, why demography is important? Let's make another example. If you take the GDP, the normal main economic indicator, the GDP can have different speed and different direction. You can have plus 1%, minus 2%. And is affected from a various multiple variables. So we have estimated GDP. But with demography, the things works differently. Indicators, demographic indicators are one way normally, are monodimensional, and they cannot be affected very easily by the other variables. Take the aging. 1 year, it's 1 year for everyone. It's the same time for everyone. And we all go in the same direction. We are born child and we hopefully die old. Unless we invent something like the movie, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. You remember this movie, no? That you born very old and you die young, but this is not happening for the moment. So we go in the same direction with the same speed. And there is not so much variables that can influence this, except a nuclear bomb or a vast famine that we are not expecting so far. This clear evidence tells you that we can use demographic tools to understand the future, of course, without being deterministic. The other thing is that this dynamics, another point I want to set out is that this dynamics set the great acceleration. Great acceleration is a scientific term that scientists use to explain how the world is changed over the last 2 centuries, and especially the last century. And this is also thanks to the demographic transition. It's a powerful engine of this change. And of course, I'm sure that colleagues will talk about the demographic transition. Now, why, if this is so important, we don't use geography and demography in our analysis? How many of you have had a course, formal course in geography and demography? And you see, this is the disaster, completely. So why this is important? And normally why geography, demography are not used? Because geography, except for nice maps, is a boring nomenclature of places, lake, capitals, this very boring atlases we used in elementary school, in the primary school. And demography, oh my God, are numbers, statistics, too difficult to read, and sometimes so disturbing to read. But this is completely wrong. This is a false perception of these two disciplines. The reality is that demography is, again, everywhere. And you cannot avoid these two long-term trends. There is another problem with demography, especially. Demography needs long time of planning, understanding, making policies, etc. With the real politics, with the politics of every day, you need very short times, especially in times of populism. You need recipes that are useful for 1 day, 1 week, maybe 1 month. But demography is not this, so you need to plan in advance. And of course, this needs to understand the demography. So now, after this first introduction, I would like to tell that for this reason, but not only for these reasons, it's important to listen about the book of Paul Morland. It's a part of trilogy. The first 2 books are the precise title are Demographic Engineering, Population Strategies in Ethnic Conflict, and the other one is The Human Tide, How Population Shaped the Modern World. And now, the last book is about the future. Tomorrow people is the future, what will happen. And Paul used, to draw the future of humanity, use 10 numbers: infant mortality, population growth, urbanization, fertility, aging, old age, population decline, ethnic change, education, and food are all interconnected, as he will explain. Now, we will use the time more or less after this introduction, 15-20 minutes for Paul to present the slides he has, I know. And of course, after a reply from Letizia, other 15-20 minutes, and then a little talk, and then we will talk with you. Okay? Get the slide. Yes. We need the slides. Who's charging the slides?
Anyone in charge of the slides?
The slides. Oh, okay.
I think we have some slides. I'm always prepared to talk without them because I never really trust the technology. Okay, so I just need to know how I can move forward. Over here. This one, little click. Wonderful. In principle. Yeah. So, good afternoon. My name is indeed Paul Morland. I am a demographer, and I have written 3 books. I don't call them a trilogy, if only because I've also written a 4th book, which is going to be published next year, on the subject of why we are all having too few children. So you asked if anyone had ever done a course on population and geography, and nobody put their hand up. And you said that's a disaster. I could ask, has anyone got any kids in here? And probably no one will put their hands up. And I would say that's an even worse disaster, but you've got a little time. But I'm not here to preach pronatalism to you. My first book was a PhD thesis on ethnic conflict and how groups in conflict use demography as part of their strategy. My second book, The Human Tide, talked about how population has driven world history. And my third one, as explained, looks at the present. What are the big trends today? How are they shaping the future? Why on earth have I got a picture of Wembley Stadium at the bottom? Well, it's not because I have any interest in football. I have no interest in football at all. But I was born, I had the misfortune to be born in Wembley and brought up there. And Wembley has probably seen the fastest demographic change of any suburb in London. I saw that happening in my youth, and when people say, how did you get interested in population, I always give 2 answers. One is I was born in Wembley, and I saw its demography change, and so I asked why, what's causing it, what are the consequences. The second is that when I got married and had my own children, I started to observe the fertility choices of my friends and family. Some had as many as 7 children, plenty had none. And so I started to ask, what's causing it and what will the consequences be? So let's start briefly with the past, and I will give you a little lecture on the demographic transition, which I hope you did something about at school. I learned about it at school in geography when I was about 13, and then forgot about it for about 30 years. I need to stay here, otherwise you can't hear me. Understood. Yeah, so before modernity, in the time of Thomas Malthus, who wrote his book in the 1790s originally, I always say we were breeding like rabbits and dying like flies. Most people had 6 or 7 children. 2 at least would die before their first birthday. Only about 2 would make it to breed themselves. And so the population went up and down, but it never really moved forward. It took between the reign of Julius Caesar and the reign of Queen Victoria for the population of the world to quadruple. I mean, we've had populations that have quadrupled in 30 or 40 years in modern circumstances, hence the great acceleration you referred to. So first of all, high fertility, high mortality, low population. Then we get to the point that modernity comes into play, food constraints are lifted. In Britain, originally, it was about opening the prairies in America, importing food on the railways, export and ships, exporting capital goods and manufactured goods. And so we get a new world after Malthus, effectively. And initially, down comes the mortality rate. People live a bit longer, but they still have large families, the population expands, and then eventually fertility comes down, people move to cities, they can control their fertility, they have other projects, and the population stabilizes. And that, I always say, is a modern process. It's a process of modernity. There's a very interesting question about what comes after that, postmodern. When we're all living long, what does fertility look like? How does that vary? And we'll come to that a little bit at the end. So I just want to give a few quick examples from history, because I'm trying to make the case in my second book that you cannot understand important historical events without understanding the underlying demography. And I'm just going to pick out a few examples. So in the first decade of the 19th century, the United States bought this huge chunk of territory from the French. And it's often asked, why on earth did Napoleon sell it? Huge strategic interest. How could the United States have expanded without it? The answer is that in the colonies, the previous British colonies, recently independent, there were 100 times more people of British or European origin, mostly British, than there were French people in the Louisiana Purchase area. So they were going to roll over that area anyway. Now, interesting question, why was that? Why did Britain have this extraordinary demographic expansion in the 19th century and France didn't? Why did people leave Britain and not France? Far too much for me to answer here. We only partially know. But the basic point is that without understanding the incredible demography, you can't understand how it was that America expanded. And actually, something I don't have time to go into, if you look at the last chunk to the west, that was taken into the United States in 1848, the war with Mexico, again, a very demographically driven event. The origins of the First World War, you can't understand the tensions that were emerging between the European powers if you don't understand how the French were terrified by overweening German demography, the sense of being outnumbered by the Germans, particularly after 1870-71, and then in turn the German paranoia about the Russian growing demography. They were all at different stages in the demographic transition, but they didn't know that there was such a thing as the demographic transition. And if you read the French, they say the Germans are always fertile, they'll always have bigger families. And if you read the German literature, they say the Russians will outgrow us, they'll outnumber us. So that was part of the paranoia, but it was also part of the result. If you look at the number of people that each side managed to mobilize, which was in pretty strict proportion to their populations, you'll understand how very difficult it would have been for the Central Powers, for Germany and Austria, to win that conflict. Moving forward to the collapse of the Soviet Union, I maintain a large part of that was the loss of confidence among the ethnic Russians. Russia was early into the demographic transition, and it was very much considered, again not understanding it, that the Russians would expand and expand, and in the Soviet times, big Russian brother would put its arm around the little peoples of the Caucasus and Central Asia. But Russia went through that demographic transition. It had a very low fertility rate as it came into the second half of the 20th century. And meanwhile, the fertility rate in Uzbekistan was extremely high. Now, it always had been high, but of course, mortality was falling in Uzbekistan. And in the early 70s, the Russians suddenly realized that they were declining as a share of the population of the Soviet Union. And if that happens, it's particularly true in the young generations. So it's getting harder and harder to mobilize an army, a Russian-speaking army, for example, to operate in Afghanistan. Is that all there is to the fall of the Soviet Union? No. Is that a significant part of the story which shouldn't be missed? Most certainly. And finally, in terms of the past, if you want to understand how it was that Japan grew as an international power, made its way onto the international stage, built an empire, and then collapsed but became an extremely dominant economic force, and then declined economically, you need to look at the growth and rise and fall of the Japanese population between the 1890s and the start of the 1990s when it started to fall. And again, that's got to do with fertility rates, mortality rates, declining working age population. So that's just a very brief view of the kinds of ways you can think about history being shaped by demography, and why, if you don't understand demography, your insight into the major historical events of the last 200 years is going to be lacking. Now let's move on to talk a little bit about the present and the future. So the way I organize my book, Tomorrow's People, is 10 numbers, and I'm not going to go through all of them, at least I don't think I am, I might not have time, but essentially they're all linked. It's not just a random bunch of things, it's a progression. So when you go through the demographic transition, the first thing that happens is your infant mortality rate falls. That has a huge impact on the population size. If you can keep people alive who would have died at 70 until they're 80, that grows the population. But if you can keep a child alive through his or her first 10 years, that child will go on and lead a whole life. And that's transformative. And what we've seen across the world is tumbling infant mortality rates. Sierra Leone, which is the worst, has gone from about 1 in 4 children dying before their first birthday to less than 1 in 10. Still way too high, but falling rapidly. A country like Peru today has the infant mortality rate that Britain had back in the 1990s. A country like Japan has such a low infant mortality rate, below 2 per 1,000, that whilst any further gains are obviously wonderful things, they will have no demographic impact. That game is through. There's nothing more to be gained from Japan's demographic perspective by lowering the infant mortality rate. And what happens then? The population grows, as I've explained. This is now happening in most of sub-Saharan Africa. The fertility rate is still high, very varied. Kenya and Ethiopia are starting to come down. South Africa has had a 2 to 3, a very healthy fertility rate for a long time. Central and Western Africa is only at the start of the fall in fertility. But however basic conditions are in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Nigeria, they are still getting much better to the extent that infant mortality has tumbled and that the population is expanding. In 1950, the population of sub-Saharan Africa was about 7% of the world. By the end of this century, it will be more than a third. And although I can't tell you exactly what that will mean, it will certainly reduce the power and influence of other parts of the world. Africa will be more important geostrategically, economically. But as the population grows, we all know the countryside is mechanized. This population can't be absorbed. People go to the cities, and if the population is expanding, these cities are on ultra expansion. Back in 1900, there were perhaps 10 cities with more than 1 million people. Today, there are more than 500. You'd have heard of all of them in 1914, and probably most of them today, many of them in China, you won't know. So people are massively more urban, and that's the result: falling infant mortality and rising population. But what happens when you get a much more urban population is it has smaller families. An extra pair of hands in the field is useful. When you get to the cities, you can often invest in your children, so having one or two or three means you can give them the education and the opportunities that you can't if you have 6 or 7. So people have smaller families, there's more access to contraception, people tend to be better educated, and so the fertility rate, the number of children per woman, falls. Germany has been low, little post-war baby boom, much smaller than most of the rest of the West. And it's been very low for decades. Nigeria is still very high. Singapore, you see a society, a highly urban society, once it got developed, it fell to little more than 1 child per woman. In Korea, the fertility rate now is 0.8, which means each cohort is not much more than a third of the size of the last one. Think what that means in terms of business, in terms of economics, in terms of government debt. And so eventually we get aging, as you have fewer births, as people live longer. We see Japan had a median age back in the middle of the century in the early 20s. It's heading rapidly for 50, as are lots of countries. China now has an older average population than the United States. That has good and bad things. Older populations tend to be more peaceful, they tend to be less criminal, but they lack a certain dynamism, and it presents great challenges to a society. The Prime Minister of Japan has talked about civilizational collapse. In Chad, however, more children are being kept alive. So initially, as you move into this transition, you actually get a slight reduction in your median age because you have more young people living who would otherwise have died. And if you get a rise in the average age, the old age population expands enormously. In Japan in 1950, there were probably only 100 people aged over 100. Today, there are about 80,000. It's rising rapidly. Japan is a foretaste of what the rest of the world has to offer. And when you think about the extra pensions, when you think about the extra healthcare someone in their 80s requires, when you think about the shriveling tax base, you can understand why it is that Japan, as the oldest country in the developed world, also has the highest debt to GDP ratio. And then eventually your population will decline. And we can see that in the case of Bulgaria, particularly. Why Bulgaria? Because Bulgaria has had a very low fertility rate for a long time. And being in the EU, it has a mass emigration and very little immigration. And so we can see in Bulgaria, the population is going to be about half its size from its peak in the 1980s. Germany would have a declining population already, but for immigration. And China has started to decline. When this chart I did originally, we didn't realize quite how quickly China's population would be declining. One way to prevent the decline of your population is massive immigration. I show here the data for the United States, which was an 85% white country in 1965, at the point that the immigration data regime was changed. The prospect of a minority majority, I think, is one of the most important things in understanding the Trump phenomenon. I think it's one of the most important things in understanding the Brexit phenomenon, the rise of Meloni, the rise of the far right in Germany. We need to understand both the ethnic change that's happening, we need to analyze the reaction to it, and we need to understand the fundamental demography that's underlying it. And I'll come back to this at the end. 2 other factors that are really important. Even though there are quantitative challenges, qualitatively, the world's population has been transformed. In Bangladesh, at the time of independence, barely 20% of women could read and write. Today in Bangladesh, just about everybody can, other than very old people who haven't had the chance and didn't go through the education system. If you look at the percentage of people going to university in China, from 1980 to today, it's gone from almost nobody to half the cohort. So we mustn't just look at the numbers. We must also think what the education of a population means and how that utterly transforms the economic and personal prospects for a population. And food production, while population growth every year in the world is declining, the population is still going up, but the growth is falling, and we'll stabilize our population sometime in the second half of this century. Food production has expanded faster than Malthus could possibly have imagined. Malthus thought that food production would constrain the growth of a population, which would double and double and double again, but it couldn't grow beyond a certain level because the world's food production simply couldn't support it. Malthus has been turned on his head. On the one hand, family sizes are getting much smaller, and on the other hand, food production has expanded, so that in principle we could now feed everyone in the world extremely well. And I want to finish by coming back to this question of immigration and ethnic change, what I call the demographic trilemma. So you can have economic dynamism. You can have what I call egotism, which is leading your personal life and not having any children. And you can have ethnic continuity. When I went to Korea, they said to me, of course we want to remain Korean, we don't want immigrants. Many countries in the West welcome immigrants. They're very different attitudes. But in large parts of the world, the president of Tunisia has said he thinks it's a horror that black African people are coming to his country. So it's not only in East Asia that some people want to retain ethnic continuity. I think it's very important to understand these three things are trade-offs. If you want economic dynamism and you don't want to have large families, you must have immigration and ethnic change. And there's no point in complaining about it, and there's no point in blaming George Soros for it. It is a factor of your choices. If you want the small families, but you don't want ethnic change, if you want ethnic continuity, you will end up like Japan, whose economy has shriveled as a share of the world, still a very positive country in many ways, but a country that is going to have real problems in keeping the lights on. The only country in the developed world with above replacement fertility is Israel. They have economic dynamism. They don't need immigration in order to maintain the ethnic balance of the country. And they only do that by having a whole child more plus than any other country in the developed world. Both Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews have about 3 children. And that is how the country has managed to square this circle. So the point of putting this up really is to say that if we understood demography, here is an example where electorates and politicians could have an honest and open dialogue about what they want. And I think that would be very healthy for the whole of society if we had a better understanding of economics, of demography, how it interrelates with economics, how it relates to immigration, and what kind of choices we have to make as a result of that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here in front of all these young people, young men and young women, that they are the future of the population. So you are really the right public for this presentation. You have heard lots of numbers, but this is really a short summary of the book of Professor Morland. Actually, the book is very dense. There are lots of other things. So what I want to say as general comment is that it is a great book and you really need to read it. You cannot be content to what you hear because there is much more inside the book. And it was really a pleasure for me to read it because being an academic, and nowadays I read lots of bits and bobs, lots of short articles. It's very rare to find such a comprehensive book that try really to go in the past, in the present, to be a map for the future. And I think that it was from the time I read The Concise History of Population by Levi Bach, that is my mentor, that I didn't read something where demography is everywhere, but there is so many things that probably if you haven't studied demography like me for now 30 years, you will not understand, but it doesn't matter because it's all truth. In the sense that what I want to say is that the language is easy, but the level of scientific, how can I say, rigorousness of this book is maximum. You can find in every line some little notes that they go at the end where there is the word demography there. So Paul was really able to do the state of art of something, and I'm so pleased about that. So something that it's easy readable, but also of high academic value. There are lots of examples. I think I will always remember about Henry VIII, who didn't have any grandchildren, or exactly, and so the dynasty ended up there, and some other people that now in Africa they have 10 children. They are so happy to be so. So it's full of numbers, it's true, and numbers are not part of our culture, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because, of course, if I am a demographer, it means that I love numbers. But I teach to students probably of your age, and sometimes they say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't love numbers. And this is, I think, the fault of who teaches numbers, because numbers are our life, and it depends on how you teach numbers. Of course, if I tell it to a journal, and also the journalists sometimes say that, oh, I'm sorry because I protest for something wrong in the mass media, and they say, oh, but I've done humanities. Okay, but this doesn't prevent us to interpret correctly the numbers, and Paul put in his book very easy numbers, but when you understand the numbers, well, when these numbers are compare each other. So if I tell you that now the natality rate, the birth rate in Italy is 10 per 1,000, what does it say? Not much. But if I tell you that having pregnancies and having kids in Afghanistan or in sub-Saharan Africa, one out of 100 women is dying because of that. Whereas in Japan, is less than 1 out of 100,000 women. You understand the distance that there is between these two conditions. So numbers are precious when we can understand it, and Paul, of course, had to run a lot in his presentation, but the figures he has shown you are very important because they tell us about the diversity of the world, about the diversity of the present from the past. We are in a unique world now that has never been like this. I always say as a mantra that we have never been so many, we have never been so old, but we have never been also so diverse in the world. In the past, there was more uniformity across countries and also within countries. So the Professor Morland book is a map, is a precious map to understand what is going on. Is also reading it is also made me curious about the author because he quoted lots of places, lots of occasions. So I was asking him how many lives he had, because he's not a normal professor. If you ask me, okay, I've been traveling, I've been doing research in several worlds, but practically I've been a professor. And I think that such a book would come only from someone who had a more comprehensive view on the world and on the thing. I like a phrase that is said in some other presentation: without the knowledge of demography, we are flying blind. So we need also these key, this viewpoint to understand the economy, the politics that are going on, because without understanding that behind politics and economics there are people, and that the consequences of economics and politics are on people, I think we miss a very important point. Today, the key word is the future. You are the future, for sure, more than us. And Paul said that the future is like in a realm of science fiction. And it's true. I mean, you are native digital, and so many things are happening in a short time. In his book, Paul acknowledged, for instance, the Green Revolution and how much the productivity and the food production has changed in decades, and how this has changed also the relationship between resources and population. So the future, in a sense, is for sure something that will be science fiction, so we cannot know what we need to learn in the future. But in a sense, some part of the future is here, because how we behave affects the population for how long? Well, until we stay in this world. So how many kids are born this year in Italy? It's the generation of those born in 2023 in Italy. And it cannot be different in the future. That remains. So how it can change? Well, it can change. We don't have migration with other planets, no? We have only one world. So either these people emigrate, or there are other people of that year that immigrate. But in a sense, we can understand a little bit what is the future. So as final, I leave you with three things to discuss. I mean, maybe four. The 0-1 that is what I already said, the diversity of the situation, of demographic situation in the world. I want to underline this because I think that this is very important, and it's very important that you understand that there never been a world before where women in Niger have 7 kids on average, and women in Singapore have less than 1. So this is really something amazing that we need to consider. And there never been a world where within the same country, differences, for instance, in survival standard can be so high. I think about, for instance, United States, where the level of survival of the poorer population and some ethnic groups are so different from others. And also this is something to consider, and how we want to treat these things will affect our future. Which future? Well, I think that we should distinguish between short, medium term and long future. What I wanted to say is that the short future, it's easier for what I just said, that the population in a certain part is already here, so we can just make them age to understand where we are going. But in the short run, it's exactly in the short and medium run that some countries, namely the rich countries, will have their higher disequalities or higher problematics. Why? Well, because there will be some imbalance between generations. If I refer, for instance, about Italy, in the next decades, those who will retire are those born during the 1960s. And those born during the 1960s, they were the children of baby boom. So there were so many. In Italy, there were born more than 1 million children per year, where now they are born less than 400,000 per year. You understand So it's also this imbalance that they will create struggle in society. Probably in the long run, this will be different. And maybe we also are going towards a certain convergence across the countries. The second thing to discuss is environment. It's true that the numbers of individuals is not the only thing that is important for environment. We know that they will continue to grow in the world because there is this population momentum that even if fertility is decreasing, the number of potential parents are still increasing, and so for a while the total population will continue to grow. But I think that also the manner, and not only the number of forks, are very important to stay at the table of the world. And so I think that thinking about the fact that there is the overshooting day, for instance, that every year became early and early and let us to understand that we are consuming more than what the planet is able to reproduce, should enter in the equation of population. And so Paul is a very optimistic author, this is clear. He doesn't have a gloomy view on anything. And he says, it always tries to be balanced. He always says something positive and negative. But, you know, for the environment, I would be a little bit more worried than what he is. And I think that instead of producing technological stacks, I would rather become vegetarian to consume less. The third thing, and the most important, is that I think that the real message of his book, or at least what I got, is that we are, what does it mean, demographic transition or post-transitional demographic world? It's a world where there is not anymore this coupling between demographic behavior and economic conditions. He said that more and more our behavior, and he refers a lot about the fertility behavior because, of course, for survival is a little bit different. We all want to survive longer. For demographic behavior, now we are in the world of choices, in the world of ideals, in the world of religion also, something that it corresponds with what we want. So there is this freedom of choose our behavior that is so important. And actually this has been an incredible revolution for humanity. Can you imagine to be able to decide how many kids we want? A concept that was not even there until last century. We didn't even think. If you ask, in my early career I was doing some field work, and you ask the people how many kids you want to have, and in some rural areas they say, how many gods will give me? Because there was not this concept of behavior. So this is for sure very important things. Still, I'm wondering if we are all free of choice. And I refer to some people in the world that are still poor, that they still don't have access, for instance, to healthcare or family planning, where maybe the idea of freedom is a little bit far, at least in demographic behavior. But I conclude also thinking about young Italians. I don't know how many of you are Italians, or how many of you live in a very low fertility country or comes from a very low fertility country, where the perception we have as demographers is that young people would like to have more kids than what they have, would like to set up their families earlier than what they have. And so is the society and the youth condition, youth, for instance, unemployment or uncertainty in the job market, then sometimes prevent people to make the choice at the time and in the way they would like. Thank you.
Okay, many things, just a fast takeaway, just to open the discussion also with the boys and girls that we have here. So, first of all, the world is never diverse like in the past, because the past was practically boring and fatiguing, and of course also the world was equal. Do you know, 2 centuries ago, what was the life expectancy in the world? All over the world. Life expectancy 2 centuries ago, just not the Middle Age, not the Christus era, bit more. Yes, it was around 25, 28, it depends on the places, but, well, we were already dying in that times. So the time changed, the world changed. Now we have very young countries, mature countries, very aged countries. This is the first time, it's a new, and the world is so, let's say, complex, just because we are different countries with different opportunity, different, let's say, risks. Another things, why young countries are more or less violent? The political conflict are there. For example, demography can explain why Afghanistan is so conflictual. The median age, which is the one that divides the population just in 2 equal numbers, it's around 18. And if you go in Southern Africa, it's around 15, which means that half of the population is under, it's below 15, and the other one is above. When you see a lot of conflict with a lot of children in Africa, it's not because they are particularly violent, it's just because the majority of the population is young. And when you see old countries that are quite stabilized, it's just because the population is rich and aged. It's very difficult in Italy to find, let's say, a group of pensioners that are aiming to reform Sanremo. That's because they are aged. And this is demography, particularly. Of course, you do not have to be deterministic, but there is something in this. So the 2 things I would like to say, of course, I think that the books of Paul are wonderful. It's just the way to explain history, politics, economics with numbers, but with very simple numbers that mean something. So I want to ask you, just for open the debate, do you think we can have 3 stages of populations, 3 stages of life of states, like youth bulge, demographic window of opportunity, and aging countries? This corresponds to 3 different kinds of possibilities, of course. Please.
Different cinemas and different times. So we know it moves faster in some places than others, so the analogy breaks down. But ultimately, I see everywhere having long life expectancy, everywhere having moderate fertility or low fertility, everywhere having a rising median age. It's just a question of how fast the poorer countries move, and then once we've moved through the transition, where we end up. Do we end up like Israel, where people have 3 children, or do we end up like Korea, where people have fewer than 1? And that makes a huge difference, and will make a huge difference to humanity.
Should I say something? Yes, I totally agree with what, of course, is said. Of course, the length of this transition is really making the difference. So, for instance, if we look at UN projections about how many people, how many billion we will be at the end of the century, this depends a lot on Africa. Paul says very well in his book that is the most uncertain part of the world. What will happen to African fertility? We think that eventually also Africans more educated, more developed, they will find convenient to have less kids. But the length of this process, the speed of this process has been proven now quite differently from what happened, for instance, in Asia or Latin America, where this process sometimes was so quick. If we think about South Korea, now for you South Korea is the champion of low fertility, but Korea has 6 children 60 years ago. And the speed of this change was incredible. And the speed of increase of education of the Korean population was incredible. There is, for instance, an article that asks, that did some projection of what would happen to Nigeria if Nigerians has progressed in the education level like Koreans. Well, Nigeria would be a different country today because it couldn't have the fertility it still has, and it couldn't have the proportion of young people growing up and probably also emigrating because they don't find enough, future and employment in their countries. So these are very important factors that they are not so clear for the future, and that actually makes the difference for our future.
Thank you. I think we can open the debate with the students. So if you have questions, please. Very good. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. I'm Rebecca Maria Serrano. I'm a GG2 student. And I have actually 2 questions. The first one is, China's one-child policy was really effective on population reduction, even if it was like on a little scale, respect, of course, to the world. And was it a smart solution? And the second one is, how Italy is located in the ranking which considers both mortality and fertility, and how is the situation different from the one in Japan? Thank you.
The fertility rate in China was nosediving before the one-child policy was introduced. And if you look at Chinese ethnic populations outside China, in Taiwan and Singapore, and lots of other populations in East Asia, their fertility rates fell very, very fast. So I think it was absolutely unnecessary. And now, of course, with China having too few people, the reverse of policy is very difficult for the Communist Party to do without losing a lot of credibility. Do you want to speak about Italy?
It's impossible to do a policy to rise fertility at 3 children China would have. About Italy and Japan, well, they're very similar. So if we look at survival and fertility, they're not very far. However, there are some differences. So Italy went in the club of lowest low fertility, so a very low fertility below 1.3, much earlier than Japan. It was at the beginning of the 90s, together with Spain and Greece. Japan arrived late. However, the proportion of above 65 population in Japan is a little bit higher than in Italy, because the survival in Japan is a little bit higher. So they are very similar. I would say that it's almost the same, but it's a little bit higher. What they have of difference, these two societies, that they are both quite traditional. For instance, if we take the gender roles and gender issues, Japan and Italy have some similarities in the position of women in the society, and this is also thought to be one of the reasons why fertility is low. However, Japan is a much more closer country, so they don't have so much immigration as we have. So in a sense, the rate of aging is quicker also for these reasons in Japan. Then there is also a little bit of a difference, for instance, in the family. Italians seems very traditional, but if you take just one indicator, one of that indicator that they speak, the number of children born out of wedlock in Italy. So among parents who are not married, in Italy we are almost at 1 out of 3. So more than 30% of children in Italy now, they are born from not married couples. In Japan, almost nothing. So there are some differences, so you can have the same result in terms of the population structure with culture and ways that can be different.
Okay, next questions? Yes, please. I need someone moving, because this is one of the other to behold, to ask. Yeah,
Okay. Okay, so the subject of demography and population is very volatile, like things change. So how do you suggest countries find that sweet spot, the balance between overpopulation and population decline?
I think that's an excellent question. A lot of countries have spent a lot of time trying to get their fertility rate down. I think that's a positive thing. I think it's good if people can control their fertility, and if and when they can, they rarely have a fertility rate of more than 3. Educated, urban, prosperous people with access to contraception. And that's quite easy to do. There's a lot of international aid going into that. India has been fantastically successful, but India is also going to have a problem the other way. And I've looked at the data on states in India, as you probably know, from West Bengal to Kerala, there are sub-replacement fertility. Now, India still has high fertility. In the Hindi belt, there's a lot of internal migration. I don't know how sustainable that is. But lots of countries, India, it's a problem for the future. Countries like Hungary are working very hard at getting their fertility rate up. I have a chapter in my next book, Can Governments Do This Successfully? And the answer is in a very limited way at best. So once you've got, governments can help getting it down, to get it up, I think that's an awful lot about culture, religion, tradition, aspiration, and I think what government can do in all of that is not nothing, but it's very limited.
My question is to Mr. Morland. Earlier on, you made mention of some figures relating to the fertility rates, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. After the slide, you made a statement about, despite having those numbers, it can't be projected what those regions are going to look like. But previously, like if you review statistics from UNICEF and other bodies in charge of handling those figures, they can like project or at least give an estimate of what those regions will look like, at least for a 5-year future span. So what makes it different this time around? What changed in the region in those times?
I think you may have slightly misunderstood what I was saying. First of all projections are uncertain. In the case of Africa, the big question, as you were saying, is how fast is fertility going to fall? And that's a really dynamic question. Will Italy manage to get its fertility rate up to 1.7 versus 1.3? Will the life expectancy in Italy go to 80 to 80? You know, it's marginal. Other than the big issue is sub-Saharan Africa and its fertility rate. That could move very fast. What I meant at the end was that the world is going to be much more African. And I don't know what that means. I can't tell you exactly what it will mean, who the stars are going to be, who the basket cases are going to be. I think we're going to see some incredibly dynamic and important countries in Africa. We're going to see other countries struggling with their fertility rates and their growing population. But I do think the future is much more African, because in 1950, the population of Africa was 7% of the world. And by the end of this century, it's going to be well over a third. So what I meant to say is it will be a more African century, but I don't know exactly what that will mean for who succeeds, who fails. And I can't tell you when World War III will break out or won't break out, or where the wars will be, or which economies will boom. But I can tell you we'll all have a lot more attention to Africa in the next 50 to 100 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then what I wanted to say is also the fact that there are some short-run challenges for that countries where fertility is still high, because what we know for sure is that in the next decades, for instance, the number of young people will grow, and will grow a lot. And there are some countries that they still see their population growing 2% per year. That it means that the population is doubling in 35 years. And these pose challenges, for instance, for the education system. So if you want to invest in young people, and we said that education is central, of course it's not trivial to have a population that doubling the number of potential students and potential young people in such a short run, independently of what it will be then in decades. But in the short run, this is for sure the situation.
Well, I will have lots of things to say, but leave space to the students, please. Next one. What is the mic?
It's here.
Okay.
I have two questions. They're going to be.
We have two mics. Okay.
Yeah, they're going
Where
to.
is you?
Oh.
Okay. Thank you. Can you stand up, please? Thank you.
Hi. My name is Joe. I'm German and Italian, and I have two questions. They're going to be a bit. They're going to need an introduction, I think. So for the first question, there's a lot of discussion about fertility rates and birth rates in countries such as South Korea in particular, and the real reason why they are lower and as low as they are. What is your opinion on that? And maybe you can, all of you have different views.
So why is fertility rate low in much of the developed world?
In particular in South Korea and countries
In
like
South
that.
Korea. So I think there's the general phenomenon of education, urbanization, and prosperity. That gets you through modernity. That gets you to 2 to 3. Why is it so low in Korea? I think Korea is a perfect storm of no traditional Abrahamic religion. So in countries that were not traditionally Christian, Muslim, or in the case of Israel, Jewish, there's a lot of Christianity in Korea now, but in the absence of those three religions, you tend to see a faster fall in fertility. Compare Thailand, say, to the Philippines. I think there's also dynamic in South Korea, and I was there earlier in the year. It's a very competitive society for whatever reason. And in these I said that when you get to the city, you want to invest in your children, you have fewer. A lot of Koreans want one child, to invest everything in that one child, to get that one child into the premium university. And if you have a second or a third, your resources are spread more thinly. It's a very urban society. Half the population lives in the greater Seoul area. It's very expensive. People said to me, how can I have children? And I said, if you prioritized it, I'm not telling you to, but if you prioritized it, you'd move somewhere else. You don't have to lead this Seoul life. You do. So I think there are some particular things in the case of Korea that point to super, super low fertility rate.
Yes, I want only to add, because we have done some surveys in South Korea, Singapore, compare also to Italy and Spain, and it's clear what is said, that the investment and the tension they have about their children is really high. So for instance, for Norwegian or Americans or European, they want to have their kids with a high education level, but for Koreans it's fundamental. So they really want that their children succeed. I think that there are other two factors. One is already what I said, gender issues, gender disequalities that is perpetrating from a traditional culture that is not changing, especially in the role of men, together with the fact that women work, and those countries are the countries in the world where people work more in terms of schedule per day. And this is becoming really difficult to reconcile with family life.
For the questions, please.
I'm Sofia Falanga.
Okay, now she's
I'm a Jiu-Jitsu and I'm from Italy. Now, for what I know, after the Chinese one-child policy, there's been a huge problem in China. Therefore, people born after 2015 haven't been, a huge amount of people born in 2015 have not been registered due to the fact that their parents would not be able to pay for the taxes imposed for people giving birth to more than one child. Now the problem is that those people now are entering the scholastic system, the academic system, but this creates a problem also for financial issues and health, for example, or whatever. Now, what I'm interested in is government's policy making. So for what I've understood, you disagree with the one-child policy, and personally, I agree with you. Now, what is your suggestion as experts in the field for the government to adjust the situation in China right now?
Well, I'm glad they've dropped it, although, as I said, if they actually move to being positively pronatal, they lose a lot of face, so it's quite difficult to do. In terms of registration, non-registration, and the general quality of the data, it's very questionable. Lots of people have different views on China from the official data. If you set yourself demographic goals as a government, and you're not an open democracy, you'll tend to produce the data you want to produce. So there are question marks about the data. In terms of how China will deal with unregistered individuals, I think that's really beyond the scope of, I mean, clearly it's a problem, but I don't think I have any uniquely interesting view on it.
Yeah, I think that in a sense, the biggest drawback of the one-child policy was this preference for son, and the fact that now there is this imbalance on the gender balance on the population because there was this selective abortion of baby girls. So this is something that is very important in some areas, that is decreasing exactly because the policies have been loose. But this led us to understand that there is not an optimum of population, and each time the governments were to enter too much in the behavior of people, then people react somehow, and the side back can be bigger than the power things. So this is very clear for China.
Just to add that this is the tricky fact with demography. Normally you have policies, you want something, and the policy is not giving you back what you want. Normally it's something that you cannot plan. For example, now we have less fertile people. So if you want to recover the old number, the big numbers of children, you can't. Because of course the number of fertile people is decreasing. And of course there is a less women. And of course this is another problem. So it's not so easy to come back if you want really to come back. Not mentioning the fact that now the majority of Chinese, thanks to different choices, they don't want more than 2 children. So the government is trying to say, okay, let's having 3 children, but they don't want normally. So there are a lot of things. So other questions?
Yes. First
of all, thank you for your speech. I'm Eleonora, and I have 2 questions. The first one is regarding the fact that nowadays we are assisting the phenomena of superpopulation, which also leads to the scarcity of resources and so on. And so I was wondering if it was possible to find a sustainable fertility rate. And the second question was regarding how is it possible to act also, because for what you explained, we can make predictions, but can we act on those predictions? Like, can we find a solution?
So I think we have maybe slightly different views on the environment, and so it's important that we both have our view. A couple of things on the environment. There was a famous American 19th century economist called Henry George, who said chicken hawks and people like chickens. The difference is the more chicken hawks, the fewer chickens. The more people, the more chickens. So I do think we have an extraordinary ability to create new resources, something like fracking in the United States. We thought we were running out of oil, and suddenly new technology, extraordinary new potential for energy. A child being born today in the developed world is a low producer of emissions, because children don't emit very much. My daughter, one of my daughters who recently had a baby, said she can't quite believe that when she sees all the equipment the baby needs. But nevertheless, in 20 years' time, when they start leading independent lives, we're planning to be at zero emissions. And I just want to make one, so they shouldn't really be big emitters. In the UK, we've halved our emissions while the population's grown. I just want to make one comment about those who say we shouldn't have children, because I don't want to create any more emitters of carbon. My argument to that is that what you're really saying is, I want a doctor at the surgery, I want someone to deliver the gas to the petrol station, I want someone to fly the plane when I go on holiday, I want a teacher in the school, I want a policeman on the... I consume labor, but I won't produce it. Other people can do that. And that actually does not solve the problem. If you won't have children because you don't want to create more emitters, but you're going to have a normal lifestyle, then I think you're being hypocritical unless you go and live in a cave.
I don't think we have such a different view. I just think that it shouldn't be an excuse, technology and progress, not to behave properly, because there are some limited resources and we need to acknowledge that. And we have now the knowledge and education to behave better. So I think we can be more, conscious consumerists instead of, I'm not pessimistic necessarily about the future, but I think that we can act individually, locally for a better world. And this shouldn't be an excuse, the fact that the progress is there. However, I think that I would remove the word problem from demography. I mean, demography, it's a fact. It's a consequence of what we have. It's something that politically we need to face, and especially to know. I insist about this concept of knowledge, because I think there is too much ignorance. And especially nowadays, I hear talking a lot, for instance, about Italian demography without understanding what we are talking about. You can do policies for families with 3 children, but how many they are? Are we talking about the population, or are we talking about a minority? Do we want to address the needs of the majority of the population, or we want to address the needs of those who have already found the solution, the way to have their kids, and maybe they can have one more? I mean, these are political decisions. These can correspond to ideals and values, but first and foremost, they should correspond to knowledge of what is going on and what are the numbers. If we don't know the numbers, we cannot decide.
Yes, just a little remark on the sustainability of the fertility. 2 things. First thing, the world is not growing like in the past. The population is lower than in the past. So the big bomb, the demographic bomb, is already exploded. Just because we are aging, some part of the world is aged, we have less and less fertile people, so the world will not increase the population like in the past. So this is the first solution, maybe, to some worries about the environment that we should have anyway. Another thing is the disequalities. 1 baby in Canada pollutes more than 7 babies in Africa. So it's a problem also of equal distribution of resources. So we need balance, and we need some optimistic view on the future. Of course, knowing the numbers, but that was the first thing I said to you. Demography is not known completely. It's just a matter of number. It's not. Numbers are the fact. Okay, other questions?
Hi, I'm Alessandro from GG2 from Italy. And so I've seen a video from Mr. Morland about him that he says about the concept, about the collapse countries about collapsing countries individually speaking. And I was pretty interested in this because there is maybe some issue about this, a lot of issues actually, that just influence the topic. And so my question is, which can be the consequences for collapse in country level because of the relevant issues we're facing, like fertility taboo, climate change, overpopulation, and aging?
Well, let me limit it to the demographic one. What are the consequences of low fertility over a long period of time? First of all, an aging society. Someone in their 80s requires 6 or 7 times more spent on their healthcare than someone in their 20s. They need pensions, they don't work and pay taxes, which is why Japan has 250% debt to GDP ratio. How will the governments finance themselves? That's the financial expression of the same issue, which is if you look at the UK, we have 1 million immigrants a year, we have sluggish economic growth, we have no unemployment, no one can get work. Workers, no one can find workers, everyone can find work. And that's just the start. One little piece of information, if I may. Japan had 100 million people in the 1960s. It went up, it went down. And people say to me, what's the problem? In the 1960s, it was fine, it had 100 million. In the 2040s, it will have 100 million. In the 1960s, there were 5 or 6 workers for everyone of retirement age on the way up. When it goes down to 100 million, there'll be fewer than 1 to 1. That is a completely different society, and I have no idea how a society is going to function where it has 1 person over 65 for everyone 20 to 65. Changing the retirement to 67 or even 77 is not going to fix the problem.
We will be poorer.
Hi, my name is Matteo Mazzantini. I'm a GG2 from Italy, and I wanted to ask a question about the rising percentage of male sons, male birth in China due to selective abortions of females. Since from what I know, it should be around really 90% of the population, or a little bit less. I don't know the number exactly, but still it's fairly impactful. I wanted to know the repercussion on neighboring countries like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, because I heard that Chinese people go there to find wives.
Just a couple of things. One is that when you look at the fertility rate and you think a little over 2 should do it, it's worse if the number of women in the fertile cohort is less than 50%. So it's nothing like 90-10, but it's perhaps 45-55 at its very worst in China and Korea. It's very much now that we've got the fertile age group where this selective abortion was happening. I'm sure that Chinese people and certainly South Korean people will import brides from Cambodia, but the sheer scale of China as a country means it would have to be hoovering up the women of the world. So this is not a solution. I think it will have serious consequences for China in all sorts of ways. A lot of men won't find wives. That will lead to a lot of frustration in a reasonably traditional society. But what I can say more as a demographer is it means you need an even higher fertility rate in order to compensate effectively, because we always express the fertility rate per woman. And if you have a little over 2 and women are 50% of the population, then you have enough to replace yourself. The fewer women you have, the higher the fertility rate needs to go.
I agree. Yeah, nothing to add apart from the fact that it's getting better in the last years. So this imbalance that has arrived until 120, 130 male boys out of girls is really going down now, and you know that naturally they are born more boys than girls. So this is, yeah, we live longer, but women suffer, men die. I mean, we can say lots of things about that. It's true.
So other questions?
microphone? Can you pass the microphone?
Okay, sorry. So I'm Julia. My question is, so how can young generations overcome this fear of raising children, considering the world we're living in and considering that it won't get better but worse? And I feel like this question raises because I've seen that in Italy there are a lot of not problems, but people are worried to raise children. I don't know if you
Well,
got the
anyone who's
question.
listened to my podcast or broadcast may have heard me say this before, so apologies. I was born 10 months or so after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were all going to be wiped out. My mother was born the year Hitler came to power. My father was born the year Mussolini came to power. Dark clouds were hovering above Europe. My grandmother was born 2 years before the First World War broke out. All my ancestors were crazy and mad to have children. What a terrible risk they took. The world actually is much safer now. People live much longer, they're much healthier. When I was born in Britain, it was one of the most advanced countries in the world back then. The infant mortality rate was about 20 per thousand. Today it's about 4. So if you are too concerned about the world to have children, first of all, I would say inform yourself about the world compared to how it was in the past. And if you think it's still too bad a world to have children in, then think just how absolutely mad and crazy anyone ever having children in the past would have been. We wouldn't have evolved from the apes if people had taken that attitude. I think inform yourself about nutrition in the world, about infant mortality in the world, about the falling rates of deaths of women in pregnancy and childbirth, about life expectancy and how that's expanding. There are so many positive things. And as things get better and better in so many ways, we seem to get gloomier and gloomier, which seems to be a bit of a change.
And also, don't you think that the media themselves should inform themselves more on mortality rate, etc.? Because I think there's a lot of terrorism in the media on how to raise children. Because, I mean, of course, we're not living in a catastrophic world.
It's matter of narrative. During the 1960s, there was this optimism and positive narrative about future progress, laundry, dishwasher, changing our life. And for sure now the narrative has taken a gloomy way. This is the real problems. There are lots of studies that they show how people react to this negative narrative that is spreading. And one thing I can tell you is that in the last few years, I just talk about the last 2-3 years, also countries where there are no real youth uncertainty problem about job market, like Norway, like Finland, like Sweden, have seen their fertility rate going down. And people feel more uncertain. This is something we should reflect, and we should reflect especially with mass media. But unfortunately, this is a little bit of a human nature. I mean, we are giving more importance to bad news than good news. And the fact that the news are spreading so much gives nowadays this idea. But it's right, we should more reflect on the reality, and progress much better, and condition of life are much better than we thought. For instance, I have a student that say, okay, but in a country like Italy that is old, people suffer more, they have a higher morbidity, they have a higher handicap, they have higher problem in everyday life. And I say, no, it's where survival is lower. In some countries that health conditions are bad all around their lives. Now, in a sense, mortality and bad conditions are confined and the last part of the life. But where health is lower, it means that bad conditions are also when you are younger. So we live much better, but we don't realize this. This is a little bit the paradox of our age.
Because it was so fast. If you think about the 60s was a kind of surprise, the economic development. Now it's not a surprise. And we face with the limit of development. So sometimes we don't realize that we are the most lucky generation ever lived in the world. It was really the reality what the world was describing. If you think of our grandfather or your grandfather with two worlds. The problem now is bad news. The problem now that we want more and more, we want, but it's not always possible. So it's kind of balance of things we really want and how we prioritize our life. Other questions, please?
Hi, I'm Hali Ababne. I'm from Jordan, and my questions are more related to the political implications of geography, if it's okay. You mentioned the fixation on ethnic continuity that certain countries have in their demographics. And I wanted to ask to what extent would you say that that fixation on ethnic continuity is unsustainable and promotes conflict and tension? Because you gave the example of Israel, and Israel is actually a great example of how a fixation on having a certain demographic of population can cause a lot of resentment and violence towards the demographic of the Arabs. And my second question, forgive me, I know they're a bit long, is do you feel that there is a danger of misuse in demography? For example, like, do you feel like there's a danger of it being misused as to justify Darwinism or other forms of supremism? Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, I think it's very difficult for people in Europe to condemn non-European people if they want to retain their demographic homogeneity. It's not for me to say to the president of Tunisia, you shouldn't want to stay Arab and Muslim. If you have a lot of black Christians coming to your country, that's a wonderful thing. As a former colonial power in Tunisia, it's not for us to preach to the Tunisians. It's not for us to preach to the Koreans that they shouldn't care about ethnic continuity in Korea. So I think we should be very careful before we preach to other people. In terms of Israel, clearly it's a country, excluding the occupied territories, which is about 20% Arab. My perception is that they live a pretty integrated life. I know a lot of Israeli Arabs, and they fear for being in the Palestinian Authority. And of course, 99.8% of Jews have been cleansed from Arab lands. So I don't really think, if you're going to point to countries in the Middle East, Israel is probably the shining example of a country where Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians live together in a way that Jewish communities have been absolutely expunged from not only the Arab world, but of course before 1967 and 1948, all the Jews were kicked out of the West Bank, out of Gush Etzion, out of Jerusalem, whereas thousands and thousands of Palestinians live in Israel. So if you're going to look for cases in the Middle East of ethnic cleansing and ethnic purity, I think you need to look at cases like Jordan, which bans any Jews ever living there, bans Jews from owning land, whereas in Israel, of course, Christians, Jews, and Muslims all own land. So I think we need a more, let me finish, we need a more balanced view on that question. So far as the problems in Western Europe, where I do feel qualified to speak, are concerned, because I think we have to speak for the countries we live in. My perspective as a demographer, and my point in drawing this triangle, is to say to people that if you do not want to have large families, but you want people in the hospitals serving you, in the shops, if you want the economy ticking over, do not complain about immigration. Don't blame it on George Soros or some conspiracy theory. Understand the choices you're making. That, I think, is the most productive thing for us in the West to think about, whether it's Western Europe or North America. But I don't feel I'm going to go preaching to other people in other parts of the world, other countries which we've colonized, like Tunisia or Korea, which was colonized by the Japanese, and tell them in a Eurocentric, racist way, you shouldn't care about your ethnic homogeneity. That really is for them to consider and not for me to tell them what to do. But I would like people to understand the choices that they have.
My name is Amin, I'm from Iran, and my question is a bit more scientific, if I would say. I heard that ethnic growth, inclination or declination, has some factors, like some factors of evolution also affected, which is that if you live in a very good community, like a place that you can have a very good life, etc., you don't want to continue, not that you don't want to, but you don't see it necessary to force the continuity of your genes, etc., while as where the life is not as good, you see the necessity of continuing your genes and your I forgot the word, but yeah, I don't certainly believe in that, but I wanted to know if that's a case or not, because it was a bit controversial to me, so I'm asking to see that. Because also I have saw economic trends where the poor countries, the population are falling down, while in the rich countries it's growing more. So I was like, this is really controversial, so I wanted to ask. Thank you.
I don't know the theory that you've spoken about, but I do have some knowledge of the thinking on why people have very small families. So once we're all rich, once we're all developed, once we're all urban, do we end up having 3 children or 1 child? And I think there are 2 explanations. One is cultural, one's biological. The cultural one says it's about religion, it's about values, and those sorts of communities will grow. And we'll end up with we'll end up with societies with patchworks of very religious people who've learned how to stay within their communities. That will be a very difficult society. The other explanation is there could be a biological phenomenon. And if it's biological, what that would mean is we'll go through another hourglass effectively. But when we come out of it, all the people with low fertility biology, if you like, genes, will have died off. And the only people left will be the people who are genetically programmed to have large families. Now, the evidence for that is very limited. But if it turns out to be the case, that may be the saving of humanity, that eventually we'll come through this hourglass, this period of demographic contraction, and eventually only those with a biological tendency to want large families will survive. If it's cultural, then I worry about the future, because it's all the nice urban bohemian liberal types who will die out, and the religious extremists, not necessarily violent, but people who want lifestyles we don't necessarily want to be the majority lifestyle in society, who will triumph. So is it biology? Is it culture? We're going to find out. You might find out. It'll be long after I'm dead.
Sorry. Hello. Here. Okay. So my name is Aurélie Eugène. I'm a GG2 and I'm from Haiti. And so here's my question. I know it might have like an obvious answer, but I wanted to ask it nonetheless. So since there's a big challenge in the world to decrease population growth because of the scarcity of resources, my question is, why in some regions the focus is towards increasing the population growth while some haven't reached their objective to reducing the birth rate? Thank you.
I think that's an excellent question, and the answer is this. If all human beings were fungible, if you could say, dear Korea, don't worry, they're coming from Burundi, they'll save you, then that would be absolutely fine. But first of all, some cultures and civilizations wish to remain ethnically homogenous, and we can condemn the Tunisian government had a lot of condemnation, but that may be what they choose as a society. We condemn the Koreans, but that may be what they choose. So it's not as if we can, and the other thing is people don't want to move around necessarily. I don't know how we would manage in London without African migration. On the other hand, we have apparently more Ghanaians working in the health service in Britain than they have in Ghana. And in Ghana, they have a much higher ratio of people to doctors. So I think we have to be careful about assuming in the West, we're very important, we're very busy, we're very educated. We won't have our own children. Someone out there will do our breeding for us, they'll bring the children up, they'll even go to the expense of medical school, and then we'll just pick them up as we like. We can't do without immigration, but I think we have to think very carefully about the ethics of letting other people do that for us. And I'm sure that lots of people who come from Africa to Europe, where we desperately need them, would actually rather stay at home. They don't necessarily want to come if the conditions at home were better. So I'm not speaking in favor of ethnic homogeneity. I live in a very multi-ethnic country. But as long as humans are different and varied, it seems reasonable to say, Nigeria, we should help in getting its fertility rate down to 2 to 3, educate its women, raise its incomes, and that will inevitably happen. But Korea, you have a problem, and just shipping people in is neither the moral answer nor a politically coherent answer. Maybe I'm being controversial.
Oh, I think by the end of the day, we are talking about well-being of people. I mean, life of people are important. I mean, if a person is born in one place, maybe he has the right to develop, live, and work in that place. So, I mean, it's not thinking to displace people that we solve problems. On the other hand, countries' economic system, pension system are still nationally. So the accountancy is still national, and of course the problems of debt or whatever, and how demography and demographic condition affects these accountants and this economic situation is national. So, I mean, this is the reality. We are in one world for something, but by the end of the day, we are also living somewhere, and it's not so easy to think that we are fungible, even if in the history, of course, migration has been a sort of leverage and, water system going out. I mean, the great emigration from Europe happened when the population of Europe increased, and when there was an extraordinary outnumbers of young people out of agriculture system that it was not important anymore, that could migrate, for instance, in the Americas. So the history is repeating itself in a sense, but it's not so easy.
Okay, next one. Please.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
My name is Lavinia. I'm from Italy. Recently, it has been tested on laboratory animals that by altering some biological processes, they are able to live much longer. And this does not seem so far as a possibility for humans as well. So my question is, how do you think that people ordinarily living until 100, 120 years old could affect demography at a global level?
Well, I called my book Tomorrow's People, and it's really about the big transformations that are underway. And then I had another section, I think I called it something like The Day After Tomorrow's People. And it looks at, I won't call it science fiction, but what if we all lived to 140? And that will obviously change everything. What I kind of assume, and what all the models assume, is a gradual lengthening of life expectancy, and in the developed world, and in the developing world, a rapid growth. Imagine we all lived to 150, provided we could stay healthy and working until we were 130, that would probably be fine. But if we think we're all going to retire at 60 under those circumstances, then of course society will collapse. So it's not just about how long we live, but how long we remain healthy and how long we're prepared to work for.
Yes, I want to add two things here. I mean, one is that life expectancy has already progressed incredibly, so the present and the near future are already so different from the past. And actually, not only we live longer, but most of people became old nowadays. This is a big democratization of old age. I mean, Seneca probably was really in his 80s, but he was an exception in his generation. Nowadays, most of people reach the old age, and this is really a fact that we see already. And if you look at how life expectancy is going, it seems almost to increase exponentially. It's really important as a trend. And there are some studies that they say is that your generation, I don't know, but I guess you are born around 2000, half of you will live more than 100 years. On the other hand, when we say commonly that now 50s are the new 40s or 60s are the new 50s, have you ever heard that? That we are all younger. This is not something that is wrong. Actually, it's totally true, because what does it mean to be 50 or 60? It means the probability to be sick or the probability of dying. And the probability of dying today at 60 is what it was 15 years ago at 50 or 45. So this is a real progress. However, as Professor said, we cannot think to work so much that the last part of life, that is the dependent part, the pensioner, whatever you want to think, I mean, some part of the life you don't work remained fixed. Because in a sense, that is the old age. But now there is a discrepancy on when you start to be unable to be productive and when you die. However, I think that there can be some graduality. I mean, it's society that they need to adapt to demography. We cannot do a binary 1 to 0. We work 12 hours per day and then 0. I mean, we can think about our other scheme, other ways to participate to the society, adjusting for the fact that we live longer and better.
Hello, hi, I'm Giulia Maria from Italy. So far we have been talking a lot about the political implications and in general the political influence on demographic policies. So my question is more on the significance of demographic policies. Do you think that they should not be politicized, that demographic policies are one of those topics, like for example, in climate change, that should not differ between the political agendas of different parties? Because, for example, different political parties have different opinions on migration, on abortion, and things that go into family planning and that affect the demographics. Or do you think that this is an intrinsically political topic and that there will always be some room to argue and some room for different political views? Or again, is there an equilibrium? The ideal situation is an equilibrium. Thank you.
I think in the developed world, in the developing world, most countries have a policy of bringing fertility rates down. There have been some controversies there. There have been politicians in Tanzania and Uganda wanting the fertility rate to go up, for example, but that's fairly unusual. In the developed world, in the developing world, where they want to bring fertility rates down, want women to have more choice and education, that is often not really very political. In the developed world, the question is, should we have pronatal policies? At the moment, lots of countries don't. For example, the EU has no policy. The British government has no policy. I think it's legitimate to say that we should. I think it's legitimate to say that we shouldn't. Therefore, I think it is a legitimate case of debate. I can't believe that everyone in the political world in the West is going to say, yes, more children is good. But I think nobody's saying that in countries like Britain or the EU level yet. We know it's slightly different in Italy. So I think we should have a debate about it, and that does mean political difference and political debate. I would welcome that, as opposed to people saying the number of children you have is your own choice. Of course it's your own choice. The number of cakes you eat is your own choice. The number of cigarettes you smoke is your own choice, etc., etc. But that doesn't mean the government doesn't have a view on what's good for you, what's good for the future of society, and therefore maybe have some policies to encourage you one way or the other.
Yeah, I can add a few things. I mean, one is the fact that, for instance, French example. In France, there was a clear pronatalistic policies since 1950s, and there were no government from the right or from the left that discussed, that put in question this. So there is this continuity in this level of policy because it's considered something that is good for everybody. This is one example. There are some other countries that they don't have open pronatalistic policies, but a side effect of, for instance, defending individual rights, gender issues, they have a side effect, the fact that fertility stay up. There were other countries, like for instance, Italy and Germany, where talking about these issues was considered a taboo. Why? Because it was the echo of Nazism and fascism policies that prevent us to talk about it. So what I notice is nowadays we are eventually talk about it, and this is very important. On the other hand, also not doing anything or not put any public welfare money on this issue is a policy. I mean, in Italy, fertility went below replacement level, so it means that children didn't replace their parents since 1977. But governments, they didn't spend a word on that for years and years. This is a policy. It means that those who have better conditions could have a different life. So I think that there are pronatalistic policies, but there are also policies that help citizens, for instance, to realize their fertility desires. And this is something that can be the same in terms of measures, but at least it can be also different and should be acceptable for any parties if you conceive it like this.
Sorry, just to add something. Demography, it's like other political sciences, is a political decision. So it's always political. The problem is, what is your goal? The real problem now is that if I say something, I can be left or right. Let's just place with migration. If I say migration is a good thing, we have people, we need people here, you think that I'm left thinking. If I say migration has to be controlled, you think that I'm right thinking. The reality is that we need both. We need to control migration, but also we need the knowing that we need migration.
I think we have an invasion of the next debate.
I just want to sum up by saying that if you Google me, you'll find my website. If you find my website, you'll find my contact details. If you have any questions, please send me an email, and I'll be very happy to get back to you.
And read the book.
So thank you for being here. Thank you for the lot of questions. Thank you for Professor Morland and Letizia. Just one final sentence. So demography can be a destiny, but it's not a destiny if you care about in time. Because of course, if you don't care about demography, demography will care of you in uncertain time, okay?
I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. We were just giving the slides for next. Okay. Thank you very much for. Prego.
So we'll have now a short pause until 4:25. But before, just a short note. Only a short notice on the use of microphones and of questions. So please write if you want to book a spot for ask a question on our group chat, and we will give you the microphone. So please, when you have to do a question, stand up, say your name, the country you are from, so that everything will be more clear. And one other last remark, please do not exit from the room during an interview, during a speech. It's not really respectful. You can do that at the end of the speech. Thank you.
Also, Please, the microphone, we pass it around. Don't pass it around yourselves, because there is a list. Now it's going to be very clear on the group chat. Otherwise, everyone is going to talk all over each other. Okay? Thank you. Also important, if you post any story, picture, whatever, use the hashtag diplomacy23.